Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Just to say, I'm just going to wait a few seconds because it takes a few minutes for all the attendees to pile into the room. We have a lot of people subscribed this afternoon. So if you could just bear with us for a few seconds, we'll get underway in a moment. Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the European Policy Centre's annual conference, where our theme this afternoon is European integration in the light of COVID-19, united in adversity or my country first. My name is Jackie Davis. I will have the privilege of moderating a series of interactive debates and conversations this afternoon as we seek to answer that question by talking about the EU's level playing field. Is it still feasible and desirable in the post-COVID era? We're going to have a conversation about Brexit. We're going to talk about whether the EU is capable and prepared to be a geopolitical actor in the new world. And we're going to talk about the conference on the future of Europe. Couple of housekeeping notes before I introduce our keynote speaker. In the panels, they will start with questions from me and then later on, I hope, from all of you. There are two ways you can ask a question. You're all muted for now. If you want to take the floor and speak, please could you click on the raise hands button at the bottom of your screen and I will come to you, I will tell you, and I will ask you to unmute yourself when I do that. Please keep your camera, your mics muted apart from that. I won't ask you, if you're asking a question, to put your camera on. I'm going to keep things simple, minimize the technological risk here by just hearing your voices. So if you're watching us in your loungewear, as I believe we call it, don't worry, we're not going to know. If you want, so that's if you want to speak. Click the raise hand button, I will come to you. If you prefer to write your question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, not the chat box, the Q&A box. And please could I ask you to keep your question relatively brief. Twitter length or less would be great, so I can see at a glance who your question's for and what it is. So that's it for the housekeeping. One more thing I should notice, there isn't a specific hashtag for this event, but the Twitter handle, the EPC's Twitter handle is at EPC_EU. So let us get underway. It is my privilege and pleasure to welcome Herman Van Rompuy, who is, of course, our president of the EPC, President Emeritus of the European Council, former Belgian Prime Minister, Herman Van Rompuy. It is a great pleasure to see you, sir, as always. Thank you for being with us, and over to you.
Dear Jackie, you hear me? Okay, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I only briefly touch upon a few reflections on geopolitical changes since the outbreak of the pandemic. For me, there are at least two striking facts. The first is that China, where the virus first appeared, is also the country where the disease first disappeared. First in, first out. And looking at the recently published GDP figures of the European Commission, I see that their economy will grow by 15% between 2020 and 2022. In contrast to the Eurozone, minus 0.6%, Germany plus 0.5%, the US 1.6%, and the UK minus 5%. So China plus 15. Another interesting fact is that China has become the EU's most important trading partner for the United States this year. If the economy is the most important parameter for geopolitical power, then China is catching up even faster. Is it a matter of regime or of policy? Not all authoritarian regimes did well in fighting the virus. Look at Russia, Brazil, or Iran. So it is not a matter of regime, but of policy. That's the answer. Populism or too much craving for popularity lead to bad policy. Waiting too long out of fear of reactions from parts of the population sets the exponential rise of the disease into motion at lightning speed. Those who do not do well internally also play a lesser role externally. But the opposite is also true. And for the latter, look at Germany in the European Union. The second fact is the election of Joe Biden. 4 more years of pointless and dangerous adventures, such as the trade wars and the leaving of the Paris Climate Agreement, have been avoided. Those elections are a geopolitical change. I read now and then that under Biden, the US will continue to fall back on itself, that America has changed forever since Trump, and so on and so on. Even after the election of Biden, we would still live in a Trumpism without Trump. So I call this a superficial analysis. Transatlantic relations, multilateral institutions, such as the WTO, UNESCO, the World Health Organizations, the G7, the attitude of the US towards Russia will change dramatically. Dialogue instead of confrontation, values instead of money and weapons, facts instead of ideology and lies. Of course, there are differences of opinion between the US and the European Union. They have always been and will always be there. But there will be a framework and an openness to talk about them in a normal way. The European Union can also work together again with the United States to adopt a common attitude towards third countries, not in the role of junior partner or without falling into the trap of what the French would call suivisme, just following the United States, as the EU has too often done in the past. Unilateralism has not brought any problem closer to a solution. There were geopolitical changes going on before Trump. Under President Obama, the US was already engaged in what was called, remember, leading from behind. And the EU's relationship with Russia and China already changed since 2016, before President Trump. It is correct to say that Trump and Putin gave an impulse to the idea of strategic autonomy or European sovereignty in a whole series of policy areas and vis-à-vis the other global actors. We must continue along this path, we as a European Union, along this path of autonomy even under President Biden. That does not stand in the way of dialogue with our transatlantic partners. It has been said many times, but if the EU wants to be geopolitically relevant, the first, not the only, but the first condition is its unity of action, as in the Brexit negotiations or in the trade conflict with the US. Remember the successful negotiation between President Juncker and Trump in the summer of 2018. With regard to recent problems in the Mediterranean, I have seen too little such unanimity in the EU, with all the consequences this has for the effectiveness of our role. To conclude, I promised you, Jackie, to be brief. To conclude, I want to say something politically incorrect. There are also positive developments. I do not suffer from Euro neurosis. We in the Union have become accustomed to a rapid succession of crises since the outbreak of the multiple crises in 2008. Each time the EU has managed to overcome. On July the 21st, we were able to agree on a major operation of solidarity. We have avoided falling into the ills of the past. Solidarity became more important than a variant of "I want my money back." And we in the Union also linked the recovery fund to the long-term objectives of ecological and digital transformation. This fact and the American elections are lights in this annus horribilis. Let us cherish them and continue to turn fear into hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, President Van Rompuy, and great to end on an uplifting note. And we will come back to discuss, particularly in relation to your remarks about Joe Biden's victory and your comments about how the EU can play a meaningful role. And you said not just a junior partner or following, but a more equal partnership. We'll come back to what that means. Going to come back on some of those positive developments and some of the less positive developments. But thank you so much for your continued leadership of the EPC and an inspirational start to our discussions. So we're going to turn first to a crucial and intriguing question. How feasible and desirable is the EU level playing field post-COVID? And I'm going to ask our panelists as I introduce them, please do turn on your cameras and your microphones so we will be able to see and hear you. And we're going to talk really about what has happened in terms of the level playing field concept has underpinned the EU right since the beginning of integration, but it's coming under severe strain. It was before COVID, but particularly now. We're going to talk about some of those stresses and strains and what it all means with our panel. Joining me to do that will be Lionel Barber, former editor of the Financial Times, Daniela Schwarzer, director of the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, and Loukas Tsoukalis, professor at the Paris School of International Affairs, Sciences Po, and president of the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy, ELIAMEP. So, panel, a very warm welcome to you. I hope you will magically appear on our screens in just a moment. Please, if you haven't activated your camera, can you do so? I think I see all three of you seem to have your mics, but not your cameras at the moment. So it would be great if we could see you as well. Lionel, I'm seeing you. Loukas, I'm also seeing you. And Daniela, great to have all three of you with us. So the format for this conversation, ladies and gentlemen, is totally interactive. I'm going to ask our panel some questions. And then, as I say, if you have questions for them, please don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A box or to raise your hand, and I will come to you to the extent that time allows. So a very warm welcome to all three of you. And Lionel, let's get underway. As I mentioned earlier, the level playing field has always underpinned the single market and that fundamental concept that has driven the EU since the beginnings, but it is under strain. It's under strain externally, it's under strain internally. We've seen significant support, for example, for companies to cope with the impact of COVID-19, a return of big government, if you like, intervention. Do you believe that what we are seeing now and those strains on the level playing field are here to stay? Or do you see it as a temporary phenomenon which will disappear internally, at least within the EU, once we're past the pandemic? How do you see the current state of play?
Brief answer to your question is that it should be temporary, but if not watched carefully and vigilantly, the common cold could turn into a severe case of flu. So I'm, like President Van Rompuy, a little bit more optimistic about the state of affairs. Clearly, this has been the most significant traumatic shock in decades, the COVID emergency. I mean, it's something which was not expected, and it's not surprising, therefore, that the sort of sauve qui peut, if I could use the French, philosophy adopted by governments, look after ourselves first, happened. But I think the key is perhaps two factors. The first is that we need to have the Commission, the European Commission, front and center of policing the internal market, applying the rules on state aid, and not being undercut either by the big countries or a combination thereof. The second crucial point is that there is economic policy coordination through the Eurozone where there is a path to recovery and indeed a path towards eventual, because we don't want to do this too soon, fiscal consolidation, a degree of fiscal consolidation. So that is a piece of it. Maybe the last point I would make, and again, I'm stealing from President Van Rompuy's excellent introduction. I really do believe that the Recovery Fund wasn't a Hamiltonian moment, but it was an incredibly important demonstration of solidarity in distress, and it showed the power of collective action, Germany playing a lead with France in a crucial role at a crucial time. So overall, I think the political context has improved, but now you need the policy coordination and enforcement of existing powers.
Very interesting, Lionel, that you're very much emphasizing, I think, that you believe that with vigilance, we can and indeed should return to the status quo ante, that something fundamental hasn't changed. I'll come back on that later. I'll be interested to hear from our other panelists whether they feel there has been a fundamental shift or this is a temporary phenomenon and we go back to where we were before. Daniela, your thoughts on that?
Well, I would argue we see an acceleration of global trends that actually play into the developments that both Herman van Rompuy but also Lionel and Barber have just described. Now, if we look at the EU's single market's position in the world, it is a world of fiercer competition, it is a world of great power politics, and it's a world of geoeconomics. So increasingly, players like China, but also the US, at least under Donald Trump's presidency, have used economic tools, including, of course, state subsidies, investment policies. There's a long list of possible tools to enhance their relative position. And I believe this is a relevant context for the discussion of the level playing field within the European Union, because as Lionel Barber has pointed out, there are many fields where under the COVID conditions, actually the role of the state has changed, more public money flows into the economy, we have loosened up state aid rules, there's a moment of fiscal policy right now, of budgetary policy, not only on the EU level with the recovery fund, but also in the member state level. But the arguments for this are not only COVID driven, but it's really the sense of increasing pressure and the question how we can compete economically, not only within the single market, but also for European players, how can they compete internationally? That's why I believe, yes, this will be, if we look back at these years, the years 2020, 21, 23, maybe, with hindsight, there will be self-correction, because I think the consensus in Europe still is that we are best served by a single market that is actually a functioning market. But the thinking about strategic industries has really changed. And again, this is not only a COVID phenomenon. If you look at the investment screening mechanism that came into force on October 1st, this is a law that goes back to the times of Jean-Claude Juncker as Commission President and has now been implemented mostly into national law by most member states in spring 2020, but taking into account the COVID situation and the increasing perception of a more aggressive China, really. So I think this is a relevant context, but as I said, I do believe the EU will correct part of what has been implemented since the beginning of the year. Just like to mention one thing, maybe we get back to this later, because there's the beginning of a discussion whether the recovery fund was, the agreement was a Hamiltonian moment. I would agree, no, not as such. But I would also recognize that the whole setup of the recovery mechanism creates path dependencies, and the EU at some point will have to find ways to reimburse the money that it has raised in the markets, which I think was the right decision to do. But this money won't come from member states' contributions, but in my view will be raised through EU taxes. And this will change dynamics within the European Union. Also, not only the fact that taxes are very likely going to be introduced, but it also may have repercussions for institutional dynamics, in particular for the European Parliament.
Thank you very much. Loukas, complete the picture for us. So Daniela, they're really suggesting, yes, we're well served, she said, by a functioning single market, but some of this debate is changing and changing in a very profound way. And you talked about strategic industries and so on. For you, Loukas, is it feasible to return to the status quo ante? Is it desirable indeed to do so?
Thank you, Jackie. I would first of all agree that the level of playing field has been a key concept in European integration. Basically, in market economies, we wanted to ensure fair play among economic agents across borders. And this has served us well. Now with the pandemic, we've been forced to lift our controls on state aids. And rightly so, because governments need to support ailing firms and also to protect people who are losing their jobs and to protect economies from implosion. But lifting the controls on state aids creates a new problem, and this is that some member states have more means, are stronger, better able to intervene and protect their firms than others. Therefore, this in itself undermines the level playing field concept. And we have decided, therefore, to complement this action with a very ambitious European fiscal package that has a redistributive bias, therefore supports the weaker, the more vulnerable governments more than others. But the next point I would like to make is that this does not look to me like just a temporary aberration. What we have been witnessing for some years is the return of the state. And the return of the state is because of a variety of reasons. It's not just a pandemic. It has to do with the protection of public goods, notably climate change. It has to do with very large inequalities within our societies. It has to do with strategic industries that Daniela has just mentioned. It has to do with the fact that we are interacting in the international trade system with countries, notably China, that play with different rules of the game. So I would submit to you that the world has changed. We certainly need competition policy, but we need also other policies to complement competition policy. This is a new world. This is not just a temporary phenomenon.
Thank you very much indeed. And just following up on that, also I'm wondering when it comes to the green recovery, so our strategic goals of digitalization, of greening the economy, moving to a carbon neutral economy by 2050, that also implies more intervention, more policy direction, and could also, in some cases, run counter to traditional notions of a level playing field, couldn't it, Loukas?
Absolutely. I mean, I mentioned already protection of public goods. The Green Deal involves massive public investment and massive public subsidies. This is not the traditional liberal market economy we're talking about. And why is it so? Because to protect the public good, you cannot operate only through the market, but you also need the state to intervene. So this is the best example of why the world we're living in is getting more and more different from the one we assumed existed before.
Thank you very much. Lionel, So how do we balance this? You said we have to be careful to make sure that the common cold does not develop into flu. We have to make sure that we protect and we apply, we police the single market correctly. You emphasize the role of the Commission in making sure that the rules are abided by. But would you agree with Loukas and Daniela, who I think are suggesting actually in some areas we have to revisit those rules in this new context and make changes because they're no longer fit for purpose in this new world? Can you unmute yourself, Lionel? There we go.
I need to take back control. Somebody else has been.
Don't.
In my opening remarks, I must have sounded a bit more Catholic than a Pope in defending the Commission and the single market and the level playing field. And let me also, I'm going to make a parochial point in a minute about the word that shall not be spoken, Brexit. But I just want to say on with Loukas, he's absolutely right, and Daniela, that the perspective has changed slightly, not just because of COVID. It really is about China and the notion that China is not practicing free market capitalism. This is authoritarian capitalism, and it's on a size and a scale that we've just not encountered before. So it would not be surprising that if I could put it this way, there is a kind of second leg. You have competition policy, but there will be something of an EU-wide industrial policy, for example, and/or the Commission may take a slightly different view of some of the mergers, for example, to get scale in certain industries. And I can see that. What I'm defending, if you like, is not that we don't have a free-for-all on state aid for the reasons that have been mentioned. Just this last parochial point. I do find it rather ironic that we've been talking about how we need to be flexible on the level playing field and things are completely different. But in the Brexit negotiations, the British government, which has wanted a flexibility, and I'm a big critic of the government and not least Brexit, but they've been hammered day in, day out for saying that they're not respecting a level playing field. And in fact, only the other day, Mr. Barnier went out into the green fields outside London in search of a green level playing field. By the way, he found one.
Indeed, and we'll come back to the issue of Brexit in our next panel. So I don't blame you for giving into the temptation to mention it, but let's not let it dominate this discussion. So Daniela, in terms of how we get this new balance right, because Lionel's saying that, we can't have a free-for-all. The level playing field concept, and Loukas saying it has served us well. You said it has as well. So how are we going to get the balance right between revisiting some of these issues, accepting that there will be much more government support, certainly post-COVID and possibly for a long time because there'll be permanent damage to some sectors, accepting that we need to look at the competition rules. How do we get the balance right and we don't, to use a rather English expression, throw the baby out with the bathwater? So we fix what needs fixing and adapting, but we keep that fundamental principle that has proved so important to the EU till now.
Well, Jackie, I would argue from an economic policy perspective, this is a rather complex situation. And from a socio-economic and social policy perspective, even more so. Now, let me explain what I'm trying to say. And much of this picks up what Loukas already said. So I think without COVID and without the economic downturn, we have had lasting divergence within the EU and in particular within the Eurozone. And this is a problem that we have known for a long while, and several efforts have been made to alleviate the problem. It's still there. More needs to be done. Right now, in the structurally divergent situation, we have a huge cyclical downturn, which makes things worse. And what governments and the EU is trying to do is to stabilize basically the economic fabric. And now comes the third element, and that is we have to undergo structure, or we have to undergo transition in the field of energy and digitization. And this is where sort of the innovative and new parts of the multi-annual financial framework, the recovery fund, and all the rest come in. And now the question, of course, for all of this is, how long should it last, and how do we balance those different objectives? And I think what we will have to learn over time, and this is really the task of implementing the various programs on the national level and making certain choices how to practically invest. We have to stabilize a minimum, because we cannot afford a lasting downturn with all the social costs and the consequences this has for labor markets, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, this deep transition agenda, which is basically an innovative agenda, in the course of which some parts of the old economy will die. That is normal. But in this economic downturn, it's worse than it would be otherwise. So I think this describes the complexity of the problem. Now, in my view, it is the approach that is currently being chosen, which is one of course, national implementation of expenditure programs, but at the same time, European mechanisms to monitor how the money is spent and how these strategic goals of transition are actually met. That's the only thing one can do at the moment. But the truth of the matter, in my view, is that no one actually really knows, because maybe some people will disagree with me, but I would argue anything that is industrial policy always has an element of trial and error, just like economic activity has. And that's pretty much the market mechanism, that you try something and it flies, and sometimes you try something and it doesn't fly.
Yeah.
So with industrial policy, you run the risk of betting on the wrong horse. And I think this is where we have to be extremely alert and self-critical on all the levels. I mean, EU level, national governments, the recipients of the money. We all have to learn together, because this is a huge agenda. And as I described in my first intervention, I think the key here is the global competition we are in. And if you take the digital agenda, I mean, we are not leading. It's not that we are defending a place. We are in a rather dire catch-up process.
Okay.
So there's a huge urgency, and we have to be ready to make errors. So we have to put out a lot of money, in my view, to make sure we can catch up.
Maybe we'll come back on how to get that balance right a bit later on. But Loukas, just coming back and linking to what Daniela was just saying, you talked about the redistributive bias in the recovery package. Have a question here from the audience, from Horst Zieler Liebentanz, saying, what are your thoughts? How can we prevent that the disparities between rich and poor countries increases? How do we use this money, this huge achievement that the EU has made in coming together and agreeing this? How do we make sure that it is used in a way that will help to redress some of this capacity imbalance, as we talked about earlier, with some countries able to do a lot to support their industries and others not? And will it be enough? Will this package be enough to do that rebalancing?
Well, Jackie, if somebody had told me a year ago that the European Union would agree on a recovery fund of 750 billion to be borrowed in capital markets, with a strong redistributive bias, and also with about 2/3 of it to be spent on public investment to bring forward the green and digital transition, my answer would have been, you are daydreaming. But we are no longer daydreaming. This is reality. Now, it's a big bet, because it's a lot of money and it's in the right direction, but now we will be judged by results. And this is absolutely crucial. If the money is spent correctly, without too much inefficiency and without too much waste, and has effects, clear, tangible effects, that on the one hand, accelerate our digital and green transition, and on the other hand, also help to narrow the gap, the economic gap between and within countries, it will be a huge success. But for the time being, it remains a bet.
But does that mean also, Loukas, if I could just follow up, that if we're going to address the inequalities issue, there also needs to be a focus when looking at how to disperse this money on social aspects, more on the just transition as well as on the green? Is that going to be part of it? And if that is the EU paying enough attention to that now? Because we hear a lot about green and digital, we don't hear as much about social.
Well, absolutely. On the one hand, there is green and digital. On the other hand, there's a question of winners and losers. If we lose that question, then we have lost the game. Because remember, one of the biggest problems of the liberalization drive of the last 2 to 3 decades has been the enormous increase in inequalities within countries, much more than between countries. Now, if the green transition brings forward many losers, then the game will be lost again.
Yeah. Lionel, just in terms of this question of the recovery, and by the way, some skepticism from a member of our audience, Nikolai Edinger, who says, yay, everything is wonderful, but where is this 750 billion euro program? We don't have it a half a year after the pandemic started. Indeed, we're starting negotiations now. The MFF negotiations, EU budget negotiations were completed this week. Details still to be ironed out. But Lionel, in terms of when we do get agreement on the recovery fund, and we've had it at the political level between EU leaders, now negotiations with the Parliament, how do you believe we get this balance right, ensuring recovery, ensuring we help the countries that need it most, but also, if you agree with it, this focus on using it to accelerate the transition, the green transition, the digital transition? Do you see some difficult choices to be made there, or are you in the camp that says, no, we can easily pick the sort of projects that bring recovery, bring jobs, and are green and are digital? There's a tension here, isn't there? Your mic, Lionel. Lionel, your mic.
Okay, I'm allowed to unmute myself. Good. So let me just say, I mean, I'm frankly pretty skeptical as to whether you can carry off all these different giant objectives of a digital transformation, green transition, solving inequality with a large recovery fund. I mean, it's almost asking too much. There's almost certainly going to be wasted money in places. That's why Loukas is right. This is a real test. But I also think that other policies are required. This has to be done as part of a collective set of policies where training, education, tax incentives, for example, on green, you need to have a sort of, I'm going to switch to German now, but a Gesamtkunstwerk. You know, it's not something where we just have a whole load of money and expect that to do the job. In similar way, you have to look at this. I tend to look at this a bit like the cohesion funds, which were obviously created partly, and Jacques Delors, you were around at the time. Those cohesion funds and EU-wide social policy was aimed at balancing the liberalization effects of the single market. And that's the way I think it should be done. 750 billion, it's a lot of money, but don't expect too much of it.
Thank you. And a comment, question from Justice Schönlau precisely on cohesion fund. What about imbalances between regions within countries? Is there more or less need for place-based cohesion policy in the new context? I think you really touched on that. But Daniela, for you, and maybe you want to pick up on that point also about the role of cohesion policy here. How do we target this money in the right way to deliver the transitions we want, but also to address and balance this question of state aids and the ability of some countries to do so much more than others?
Loukas has already said all the right things, that of course it now shows that some governments have more fiscal space than others, and those are the ones that are, when I talked about the divergence, the structural divergence, are on the side of the stronger ones. So here's the problem. And I think it was right, first of all, to be so quick in putting in place the European programs that can compensate for the lack of for instance, public banking infrastructure that some countries have and others don't to support their companies. So this was good and is correct and should go on. Now, implicitly in that question on cohesion funds, or actually no, explicitly, was the point, should we take a regional perspective or a national perspective? And I strongly believe we should take a regional perspective. That means that we have to be very aware that the current situation we are in not only increases the divergence between member states, but also severely within member states. Why is that so serious? Because as we see, this can also lead to political destabilization and really this feeling of disconnection in some regions. It's not only a European phenomenon, we've seen very much of that happening in the US over the past years, well before Trump. And I think this is why this is not only a question of economic policy, but it's basically the question whether we manage to ensure that we have a cohesive base for functioning democracy. So I think it's a very, very important question, how we deal with divergence, what we do and under which conditions. We do more for mobility because that has its upsides, but also its downsides, because in some cases it has actually strengthened regional divergence. So yes, I think it's a crucially important question for the European future.
Thank you. We're going to talk in a later panel, focus on the external relations dimension of this and talk a little bit about trade policy there. But I'm just wondering the degree to which you believe we can talk about this issue of level playing field internally within Europe and externally as if they're two separate issues, or do you see them as intertwined? And before I come to that, I have to read a comment out from Andrew Duff saying to Lionel, with respect, Lionel, rather misrepresents the EU's position on state aids in the context of the Brexit FTA. Michel Barnier wants UK to tell him A, what its policy will be on public subsidies to industry, and B, what the UK's procedures will be to regulate the application of these policies. So far, London has offered only inadequate answers. So I don't want to get into a long Brexit discussion, but I know Andrew will kill me if I didn't put that point to you. He's saying it's about the EU wanting to know what the British government is planning rather than insisting that it can't change the rules. But Lionel, I'll give you a chance to respond briefly when I next give you the floor. But I just wanted to come to this question of the external and the internal, and whether we can separate these two issues. Loukas, you talked earlier about supporting companies who are facing distortions of the global market, who are facing other countries that are supporting more. So these two things are inextricably entwined, are they?
Absolutely. And I can also give you another example. This is about climate change. I mean, Europe, in its attempt to reduce its carbon footprint, it has been outsourcing a large part of its polluting industry to the rest of the world, and it's importing the goods. So in terms of international trade, if we seriously believe that climate change is a key objective, we have to think of introducing instruments that create a level playing field also regarding the polluting effect of our industries. In other words, may I use the diplomatically impolite term, carbon border taxes?
Thank you, Lionel. The link between the internal debate on the level playing field and the external one. Can you put your mic back on? Thanks.
I wouldn't dispute what Andrew's saying, and I'm certainly not carrying water for this administration in London. It's about the government wanting freedom of maneuver, and that's not just as a way of kind of circumventing the single market rules. It is about adapting to some of the challenges that have been alluded to at the beginning of this conversation.
And in terms of,
I mean, personally, I would be happy if they just followed EU rules. It's just a shame that we don't have a seat at the table. But I think that's the point. It's about freedom of maneuver.
But in broader terms,
it's not specific yet.
putting this UK aside for a moment, do you think more needs to be done to ensure a consistency? Same question to you, Daniela. Consistency between what the EU is doing internally in relation to level playing fields and internationally on the global stage. Do we need more joined up thinking here? Lionel and then Daniela.
Well, it would be nice, but it's going to be difficult because of what Daniela said. Well, I think, again, Daniela and Loukas have both correctly alluded to the new, what is different. I mean, I was trying to defend, and I would maintain one needs to do so, that to strip or weaken the Commission at this point is dangerous, because then it'll be a free-for-all. But I think, number one, the COVID has turbocharged the internet, and the internet and digital revolution is a tremendously disruptive force in the economies, in terms of employment and companies. And the second point is China and what China is doing with its weight in the world.
Yeah. Daniela, comment to that if you would, and also a question that links to what you were talking about earlier when you said we're going to bet on some things that don't work. We have a question from Alison Hunter saying, is there a culture, appetite, capacity in the European Commission and member states to be able to work with a sort of trial and error experimentational ethos that you were talking about and arguing we need? So comments to both if you would.
Thanks. Yes, I'll start with the connection between the internal debate on the level playing field and the international dimension. I think there are very, very clear links, and increasingly so. So one is obviously competition policy, where the paradigm of the sort of internal competition policy of the EU has always been that the relevant market where this competition has to be upheld is the single market. And now, and at the latest, since the decision on Siemens and Alstom not to allow their merger, I think we have moved ahead in the discussion in a global competition perspective. Is that actually the right principle? And I know there's a huge debate on this, but I think going forward, this will intensify that we really have to consider under which conditions we want European champions in relevant areas, and how we make sure that we then turn our negotiation power to a level playing field on the international scale. Second example for this, yes, just to follow up on what Lionel and Barber just said on China. Here, I see a potential now for Europeans to work with the Americans when negotiating with China, under which conditions we give each other market access, where the ongoing problem from a European and of course also from an American perspective in the Chinese market has, for instance, been access to public tenders, rules for public procurement in China, the question of the conditions imposed on companies present in the Chinese market. Is it comparable to the ones we impose on Chinese companies in the European market? Of course not. And so here's the level playing field discussion live and in color on the international level. And of course, if we manage to bring together the US policy towards China in a more constructive way with the European one, of course, the negotiation power may increase. So I think this is one of the most important things going forward. Then the question on culture, yes, I mean, we don't traditionally have this inbuilt into our DNA that we like to fail, but I think this is very much the moment of time, because there are so many uncertainties and such a pressure to move ahead and to innovate. So we can learn a lot from other world regions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Question from Just van Eersel and Loukas. It was something we've touched on, and Daniela talked there, but perhaps get your thoughts as well concerning industrial policy. Who is going to select the winning cards, the champions, and on the basis of what criteria, if more or less commonly accepted conditions to a level playing field and a corresponding competition policy are partly replaced by national policy, with each having its own priorities that may be mutually competing. So what is your view of an industrial policy that will adapt to these new circumstances, to this new reality we're talking about, and how are we going to make sure that we get this right? Loukas.
Well, some people don't like industrial policies, so others would talk about strategic autonomy. in strategic sectors. Now, my answer to that is we need to adjust to a different world where there is China, but it's also not only China, there are other countries as well. The problem is that this will require a very major mental shift in Brussels and a number of national capitals, and that will not be easy at all. Brussels has not been brought up to think strategically.
Thank you. A thought to that, Lionel? How do we get this industrial policy right?
Well, I slightly disagree with Loukas. I mean, he's right. It's sort of a 50-50, I think. Score draw. And what I mean by that is, you know, think about the conversations we used to have with Vicomte d'Avignon. I mean, if that wasn't industrial policy, I don't know what. I mean, now that was the steel sector. Think about Airbus. That's an industrial policy. Now, it did require, you know, intergovernmental cooperation. It wasn't some federalizing instinct or whatever, but it happened. And my goodness, aren't we grateful that we're not dominated just by Boeing? Third, I think that for me, the wake-up call was on Huawei and 5G. We suddenly wake up to the fact that we don't have anything in 5G. We're totally dependent on 5G. And then worse, we get bullied to death, all of us, by the way, the British, the Germans, the French, on whether we can actually buy from the Chinese. And there's worries about, this isn't just yogurt, this is about national security with Huawei. So I'm just saying, you know, the European companies were wiped out 15 years ago, 10 years ago. Here, I agree with Loukas. These are the areas where pan-European cooperation, call it what you like, whether it's strategic economy or industrial policy, is a good idea.
Okay, thank you. We are almost out of time in this session. I should say some of the questions that have been coming in much more relates to our panel later on the EU's role as a geopolitical actor, and also there's a question about the Conference on the Future of Europe. I'll park that, if I might, until we get there. I saw a couple of hands up, but they came too late. I will get back to more of you in the next session, but before we close, and in a minute each, I want to go back to the title of our event today, and we're talking about how we foster a sense of unity in adversity rather than the my country first approach that we have seen in some countries, and there is always that risk, as you have indicated, in the EU in the face of the impact of the COVID crisis. For each of you, if you had to identify one priority in order to ensure that as we address this changed reality, this new reality, we get this right and we restore faith in the concept of the level playing field, but adapt it to that reality. What for each of you is your key priority? What's the one thing you think the EU needs to do? I'll go Daniela first, Lionel, and I'll give Loukas the last word. Daniela.
I think the unity sentiment has suffered in the COVID-19 period because of a lack of mobility and actually seeing each other. So on top of what we have, if there was one thing that I would add, it would be a very strong investment in mobility, research and education to prepare the next generation to pick up the challenge in a better way than we are currently doing.
Thank you very much indeed. Lionel.
I just want to say the PPP example is very, very interesting. All countries went their own way, and then suddenly you had cooperation. That's something to build on. But for me, I'm a believer, a great believer in institutions. So the best hope, I think, is that you don't undermine the Commission. You make sure you have top people there, so it's seen as a fair umpire in policing the single market. And then if you have those people talking in terms of industrial policy, enlightened, then we have a chance. So I'm going to put my money on institutions.
Thank you very much. Loukas.
Well, the decisions we reached in July were revolutionary decisions. Let's ensure their success and consider them not just a one-off exercise, but paving the way for the future of European integration.
And on that note, the audience can't thank you in the traditional manner, but let me do it on their behalf. Thank you very much to all three of you for a great, provocative and challenging discussion and getting us off to such a good start this afternoon. So thank you to all three of you. And as I mentioned earlier, and some of your questions do really rather more relate to our later panel, where we're going to ask the question, is the EU capable and prepared to be a geopolitical actor in the new world? So we'll come back on many of those points later on. Could I also ask you, please, to confine your things in the Q&A box, 2 questions to our panels rather than lots of comments, because it's difficult for me to wade through a lot of comments in order to pull out the questions quickly and at a glance. But we're now going to turn to something Lionel talked about. It was inevitable, but now we do want to focus on it. We want to talk about Brexit and our very straightforward title, Deal or No Deal. And for this, I am delighted to welcome John Kerr, who is a member of the UK House of Lords. He's on its International Agreements Committee, and he is, of course, known very well to many people in Brussels as a former British ambassador to the European Union, and he was also ambassador to the United States. And he's in conversation with Fabian Zuleeg, the EPC's chief executive. So a very warm welcome to both of you. It's great to have you with us, and let us dive into that conversation now. I'm seeing Fabian and John, if you, there we are, super. Can I just start with your assessment, John, of where we are? We have a thing called EPC Update, which many of you join on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. And every time I ask the panel, so this is the moment of truth. Charles Michel has called it decisive. The coming days will be decisive. He said in early October. We're now in mid-November. Are we actually now, people talking about next Thursday, John, is this the moment of truth?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it was very unwise of the British to reject the idea of an extension in the summer. There can't be an extension now. It's legally impossible. And I think the terms of the deal are perfectly clear. The only thing that's unclear is whether Mr. Johnson wants to buy it.
Fabian?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a discussion around how many days you can still push it, but we are really talking about a short number of days. We still have to get through a process of ratification, of discussion. Often in the British debate, the role of the European Parliament is more or less ignored. I think we are really getting to the point where even if we don't have a full deal on the table, at least we have to see what the landing zone is so we can work it through and put it in front. And there will have to still be discussion at member state level in the European Parliament. So we are really getting into the last days of getting that done.
So you're, in a nutshell, Fabian, if I was to ask you now, put your money where your mouth is, deal or no deal? Which do you think it will be?
Well, I've been long convinced that it's not going to be a deal. I'm still hoping that in number 10 there will be a reconsideration, that they will put the economic, social cost of no deal over and above the political consideration, the ideological consideration, the sovereignty issue. But for the moment, at least, I think that it depends really on the balance of what Boris Johnson sees as being in his best political interest. And I don't see any indication yet that has swung towards a deal.
But can I ask you, and in asking you what your nutshell answer is to deal or no deal, I just want to add, I mean, I'm frankly a little bit puzzled because we have seen over recent months, there are moments when the UK government talks up the possibility of a deal, sounds very positive, then suddenly says it's all going disastrously wrong, then cancels the talks, then puts them back on, this yo-yoing. Has this all been, do you believe, sort of brinkmanship, game playing, playing to the domestic gallery, and they do know whether they want a deal or not? Or are they genuinely, you said, the question is whether Mr. Johnson is going to buy it. Is he genuinely not decided with 6 days to go whether he wants this deal or not?
I don't know. He doesn't consult me a great deal. I would remind you, Jackie, that he was famous as a journalist for missing deadlines, and he made up his mind to join the Leave campaign before the referendum on the basis of writing 2 articles, one saying we should remain and one saying we should leave, and deciding which one read better. I really don't know. There is, of course, a myth in Britain that the EU will always give you something at the end if you stay very strong. So he may think he can still get a better deal than the one that's on offer. He's not right. The myth is based on one's experience of negotiating internally in the EU, where it is true sweeteners tend to be found at the last minute to buy the last holdout to sign up to the deal. But he has no experience of the EU negotiating with an outsider. And I have some experience of accession negotiations when I was permanent representative, and it isn't like that. It's on the table now. It's not going to change. He just has to make up his mind. I think it's very likely he hasn't made up his mind, but I think he's got 1 week to do so.
I'm interested in what you said. If I could just follow up, as a seasoned negotiator yourself, David O'Sullivan, of course, chairman of the East PC governing board, and a very experienced trade negotiator, former ambassador of the EU to the US. He said in a tweet the other day, it's negotiations 101. That a country will only, or the EU will only reveal its hand if it's sure that the other side actually is serious, that it wants a deal, and that this ambiguity has been counterproductive. You said, the UK is working under false premises from outside, but do you think it's also been positively counterproductive? Would you agree with David on that?
No, I don't think so. I think Michel Barnier is a very shrewd negotiator. And I think
no, he was saying from the UK's point of view, not revealing your hand at this point is counterproductive.
But I think Barnier knows perfectly well what is the British hand,
right.
And I think the negotiators understand very well. I think everybody is waiting for Mr. Johnson.
Fabian.
Yeah, I think we know what the deal is. I think the difficulty has always been, it's not that Boris Johnson doesn't want a deal. He wants a deal. He just doesn't want the deal which is on the table. We know what the issues are. And I think the biggest issue is that Boris Johnson is worried about what he can sell and whether there will be political consequences for him. But the positions are very clear. I think the landing zone is very clear. So we just need to get a decision. And at the moment, I'm not sure whether Boris Johnson has made that decision finally. As John has said, he has a tendency to wait till the last moment. And I think that's another danger we also have to take into account. It might well be that there's a miscalculation on the UK side. That the last moment might pass, and then we cannot get a deal through. So a no deal by accident is also something we have to take into account.
I think that's
John,
very... Jackie, by the way, I've always slightly differed from Fabian on would it be a deal or a no deal. So great is the economic case in the UK for a deal that it seems to me that much of the pressure on Johnson must take him towards a deal, including from Mr. Gove, who is in charge of managing the situation at the frontier on the 1st of January, and is aware that no deal makes the situation at the frontier quite a lot worse. But Fabian is absolutely right when he says that the judgment for Johnson is political versus economic, but the politics, the political constituency he's worried about is 50, 60, maybe 70 conservative members of parliament who would find it very offensive that the EU should have any monitoring role on, say, level playing field. It is a question of a strange autarkic view of sovereignty on the one hand versus the interests of the country and the national economy. But I don't know which way Mr. Johnson will go. I genuinely don't know.
Thank you. Before I go out to the room, I wanted to follow up talking about the House of Parliament. Could I just ask, we had two people, Maria Nitsumi Dumas and Paul, I can't pronounce your surname, Paul Alvatsmark, who had their hands up in the first panel. If they still want to take the floor, could they leave their hand up? If it's not Brexit related, perhaps put it down for now. But John, I wanted to ask you about the Internal Market Bill, because you and your colleagues in the House of Lords led the movement which resulted in the House of Lords resoundingly rejecting this move by the British government to, by its own admission, break international law by putting in clauses that ran counter to the withdrawal agreement. The government has insisted, looked as if you might be providing a way for Boris Johnson to back down from that, given the furore it has caused, not only in Europe, but also on the other side of the Atlantic. Government has insisted it will reinsert those clauses. Did you do it in the hope that you would give them a way out, or did you do it as a matter of principle to express the outrage of the House of Lords at the breach, this breach of international law? What was it about?
The House of Lords believes in the rule of law. The House of Lords was genuinely shocked by an enormous majority, the biggest turnout against the government ever in the House of Lords. It won't do. We can't preach rule of law. We can't go around the world talking rule of law and take powers to break a treaty that our Prime Minister sold to the country and signed and we, Parliament, ratified less than a year ago. It's unthinkable. Jackie, if our next question would be, I guess, supposing he does put the clauses back in the bill, what will we do then? The answer is the House of Lords will throw it out again. I'm quite sure of that. What happens in the constitutional crisis that then emerges, I don't know. But I'm quite sure that we meant what we said. It's my belief that we will not be asked to look at these clauses again. If there is a deal, I think they will disappear. And the narrative from number 10 will be, it was a masterstroke. It was putting in this threat which caused the EU negotiators to crumble and produce the fantastic deal which Boris Johnson has secured next week.
So was it a masterstroke, Fabian?
Well, certainly it wasn't a masterstroke, but I fully agree with John that if we get into that situation, they will try to sell it as such. But I think the difficulty with the UK Internal Market Bill is also that I think in the House of Lords, there are many people who understand the significance of that, and they also understand that for the European Union, this is a line which should not have been crossed. It will have a lasting damage. The trust, which was already very weak, has weakened even further. But it also is still a major roadblock in terms of reaching an agreement. And there's a very difficult timing question here. If these clauses are not removed before there's a discussion in the European Parliament, I don't expect that the European Parliament will pass a deal. And certainly it cannot be the case that the European Union looks like it can be blackmailed by these kind of clauses. So I think there's still a difficult question to come. At what point do you pull these clauses if you really want to deal? And all of that really presupposes that you want to deal. I think it's not a good sign that after the House of Lords removed these clauses, that the immediate response was, we are going to put them in because we need them. So now there's a narrative which makes it very difficult for the government to climb down.
Okay, let's take a couple of, and I'm going to ask for very brief questions because we don't have long. I'm going to read a couple out, but John Palmer, you have the floor. Can you unmute yourself? And away you go.
Yes, thank you very much. John Kerr is a good Scotsman, and as such, he will know that the people of Scotland are saying in a polls, overwhelmingly, they insist on the right of a plebiscite on independence. It looks from opinion polls, it would be passed. What does he think? And what does Fabian indeed think that in a post-Brexit situation, however it ends, unpleasantly or very unpleasantly, that process of handling the negotiation would be received, should be received at your end?
Okay, I'm going to throw in the other questions so we take them all in one round because we don't have long. Paul, if you still want to take the floor, can you unmute yourself? Not at the moment. Okay. Just a couple of written questions. What will the situation look like for the Irish situation if the landing zone is a no deal? And there's another one a little bit longer. If we end up with no deal in the next few weeks, do you think the EU will put into the public domain the text it would have signed up to in order to shine a light on the cost of the UK's ideological priorities that Fabian spoke of and set the context for a potential resumption of negotiations next year? And this I would like to link to a question about whatever happens, deal or no deal. What about the long-term relationship? Because whichever way, if it's a skinny deal, there's a lot still to talk about. If there's no deal, the two sides will have to come round the table. John, perhaps a word on Scottish independence first, and then Fabian, that other question and the Irish point. John, Scottish independence.
I think it is the case that the principal argument used by people like me in the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, that it would be, if Scotland went independent, it would ipso facto leave the European Union and would have to apply to rejoin. And that would take some time. That argument is now completely gone. There has been for 10 months now a majority in the public opinion polls in Scotland for independence. I personally think that it's a very open question still, because the economic damage to Scotland of splitting the Union of the United Kingdom would be quite a lot bigger, about 5-6 times bigger than the economic damage of leaving the European Union now. So I'm not sure it's a done deal. I think the Irish issue is, it's much clearer what is going to happen. I think that we are seeing the end of the sad century of separation on the island of Ireland. I think that the effect of the withdrawal agreement and long-term demographic trends and the success of the Good Friday Agreement is to lead towards the unification of Ireland. And I would expect that sometime in the next 10, 15 years.
Wow, thank you very much. Fabian, perhaps on the question of the long-term relationship and what happens if there's no deal, does the EU start from where it would have left off, what was on offer? What do we do in the event of no deal? But even if there is a deal, I know the EPC has launched a new initiative in relation to trying to build and deepen that long-term relationship and get the conversations going that need to be had. Maybe you could say 2 words about that.
Sure. I think it's important to start from the point John made, that the situation we're now facing is bad, worse, or catastrophic. The bad case is we get a deal. That's good because it gives us a starting point for the relationship. It gives us dispute settlement. It gives us a relationship. So it's certainly better than no deal. But it is still a very thin deal, and there are very many questions which haven't been addressed. So even the best case scenario is not particularly good. But no deal is worse. If there's no deal, then it gets very difficult. And I think we could very easily end up in a situation where things get catastrophic, where we have confrontation on a number of issues. And that would also mean that we're not going to go back to the negotiation table anytime soon. So the situation could be an impasse, which could last a number of months or even longer, which would have a very detrimental effect. Now on Ireland, I think the question there would be, it's not just a question about no deal, it's the question about whether the UK government will keep to the withdrawal agreement or not. And there, I think the balance has swung a bit with the Biden presidency. I think the political cost of now reneging on the withdrawal agreement has increased. So I think it's rather more likely that the UK, even in a no deal scenario, will keep to that.
And could you say 2 words
on the
about
long term? Yeah, on the long-term relationship, I think whatever happens now in the negotiations, we will have to have a relationship. The UK and the EU are close neighbors. We have so many shared interests, so many shared issues which we need to deal with. Even thinking to next year, we have the COP26 question. We have G7 being chaired by the UK. So we will have to talk to each other. And for that, as you mentioned, the EPC has now started a new initiative, a track 2 negotiation, where we try to bring together thinkers on both sides of the channel to have a discussion around what could be long-term solutions for some of these common challenges.
Thank you very much. John, you wanted to come in and I wanted to ask you, what are we going to do to put this relationship for the long term on a better footing, on the right footing, whatever happens in the coming days?
Do a deal now. If Fabian is right, if we don't do a deal, the relationship could get very rebarbative, at least on the British side. It won't be our fault. It will be the EU that has wrecked our Brexit. And we will get very stroppy for a period. I think actually there would be deals done, side deals done on aviation, on possibly on haulage, and certainly on security. I think some of the disastrous consequences of having absolutely no future relationship treaty would be mitigated. But I think it would get very nasty for a bit. And I think the idea of sort of picking up the dossiers where they were left and carrying on in the new year, that is for the birds. That is absolutely not going to happen. Probably the EU will say some fairly rude things. The British will certainly say some rude things, which will make it very difficult to get the show on the road again. In the end, the show will be on the road. In the end, the English will be back. The English are Europeans, actually. And in 20 years, 30 years, the Brits will be back knocking on the door saying, please, please.
I do hope you're right. And on that note, John, particularly Fabian, thank you so much. And John, good luck in the House of Lords. Continue fighting the good fight. We're all watching you and cheering from the sidelines. So whatever happens, keep it up. Thank you so much to both of you. Fabian, I know we're going to return to this topic again and again in the fortnightly updates, but thank you so much to both of you for now. We're going to turn now back to a topic that Herman Van Rompuy devoted much of his opening speech to, and particularly, he was talking about the changing global dynamics, the changing geopolitical situation, and he talked particularly about what a Joe Biden administration would mean. But we want to talk more broadly, that is of course part of it, but more broadly about, is the EU capable and prepared to be a geopolitical actor in the new world? And joining me to discuss this are Rosa Balfour, Director of Carnegie Europe, Anthony Gardner, former US Ambassador to the European Union, Natalie Tocci, who is Director of the Istituto Affari Internazionale, and David O'Sullivan, Chairman of the Governing Board of the EPC and a former EU Ambassador to the United States. So a very warm welcome to all of you. It is great to have you with us. And I look up, yes, all the cameras are coming magically on. Tony, thank you. I was going to say, we could hardly see you there. Great to have you with us. Let us dive straight in. And let's just start. I'd like your first answer to this question of whether the EU is capable and is it ready, is it prepared to play this role? Rosa, yes or no?
Well, let me just spend a few words on words, because I think the geopolitical commission is a rather ambitious terminology. And I'm always mystified by the fact that the commission chooses ambitious terminology with the risk of raising expectations it cannot fulfill. So if we look at what does geopolitics mean? So the classic definition is geography influencing international relations, right? So that makes me think back to the late 1990s, early 2000s, where the European Union enlarged to Central Europe, brought in 10 new member states, developed the neighbourhood policy, and did so by tapping into its multi-level toolbox, trade, aid, development, diplomacy, even security by working with NATO. That was, I suppose, a geopolitical commission. But it's not what we're seeing today. Which makes one think we've actually expanded the toolbox enormously since then, but seem to be less capable of being geopolitical, being geopolitical. If we take geopolitics as it is understood now, which is a bit closer to sort of classic realism. So there's the return of geopolitics, balance of power, geopolitical rivalry, etc. Now this presupposes unitary actors and some clear interests. And this is what the EU does not really have. And that's one of the reasons for which we're not seeing the EU behaving geopolitically even in the neighborhood. If by geopolitics we understand a European Commission that goes global, but also uses its multiple tools to pursue political interests, then I would say that the EU can do that. It has the capacity. And if it expands its toolbox more in the sort of economic field and all these issues that we've been talking about, then the recipe is there. The problem is that we have a mismatch between political intent and capacity. And that's where I think the EU has been stuck. Of course, Biden has, Trump has pushed this debate on strategic autonomy and strengthening Europe's international role, but I think we have underperformed in that field. So I'll leave it there, and plenty more for discussion.
Absolutely. Tony, very warm welcome. Thanks for being with us. Your answer to the question, are we capable? And are we ready? Are we willing to play that role? How do you see it now?
Well, clearly capable, yes. So, the EU, in my experience, repeatedly underestimates its leverage and its power. Certainly in trade and certainly as a regulatory power, where it is a superpower, but it doesn't often understand that as it should. It reminds me of that character in Moliere's play, I forgot which one, where someone told him, you've been speaking prose your whole life, and he said, I wasn't aware of that. Well, the EU has the power and sometimes isn't aware, or at least isn't prepared to use the leverage it has, and sometimes, frankly speaking, wastes time trying to be influential in areas where it can't be, instead of focusing on areas where it can be. Trade, certainly, and in trade it has and should. Look, the International Public Procurement Initiative is a good example where it can really drive change. And in regulation, it certainly can drive change. And I think under Biden administration will be more aligned than before in driving that change. That's how I perceive geopolitical actor. I don't see it as necessarily just as a security or a military concept. It is how do you protect and project your interests around the world? So the answer is yes, it can. Does it want to? I think in some cases it does.
In some cases, but you indicated in some cases, but they may be the wrong cases. You said sometimes it focuses more on areas where it can't than where it can. Why do you think that is? And can you give me an example?
Well, this may be a bit controversial. When I was in Brussels, I saw a lot of effort being spent on areas of the world that I thought the EU has perhaps marginal leverage. I think Asia is one of them. Some member states perhaps have more. But look, the EU, in my view, should really focus on its unique selling proposition, USP, its neighborhood, where it clearly has influence in the Balkans, in Northern Africa, and obviously in the Sahel, so a little bit further afield. And in trade with the United States and with its FTAs around the world, those are clear. But when it starts getting active in more far-flung areas, I start being a little bit skeptical. It doesn't need to be at every negotiating table. It doesn't need to be omnipresent everywhere. It needs to focus on where it truly has leverage. And look, the best way of identifying where it has leverage is asking the question, where do the Chinese view the EU as being relevant, right? And clearly, it's the power of the single market. Clearly, it's the power of the regulation that brings the Chinese to the table. That's a pretty good indication of how they think the EU is geopolitical.
Thank you. Come back, I hope, later on China if we have time. Natalie Tocci, your basic answer to this question. I think so far we've got capable, yes, tools and instruments, yes. willing in the right areas, not necessarily. What is your answer to the question?
I would say that, a sense of sort of paradox that we're living through at the moment is that we went through the sort of previous 5 years where, for a set of sort of exogenous reasons, there was a sort of internal EU push in realizing that there had to be a greater assumption of risk and responsibility. And yes, indeed, particularly in areas like security and defense. And I agree with Tony, obviously, these are not the areas where the EU is strongest, but very clearly they are the areas in which we were most deficient. So I think it was and it is fair that that push came in this direction. The paradox, I think, of those years, the previous 5 years, was that all of a sudden we kind of started talking and agreeing on a number of things in this particular domain at a time in which we were terribly divided internally on the kind of things that normally European integration is kind of made of, meaning particularly the economic as well as obviously the migration. Now I think what we're going through over the course of this pandemic is a refocusing of the lens, in a sense, inside, which in a sense means that we are more united, particularly on some of these economic dossiers, which in a sense creates a better and a sort of more resilient prerequisite to have that stronger global role. But if you then look at the extent to which the priority is given to the external as opposed to the internal, then one does indeed slightly despair at the moment. We see it, we only need to sort of think about the amount of money being devoted to some of these things. So whereas we've seen over the course of the pandemic, a sort of, a pretty momentous enlargement of the overall pie, in terms of EU funds and the budget. If you actually look at the amount of money that will be dedicated to global issues, be it security and defense or otherwise, it's basically been halved.
Okay, yes, so not putting their money where their mouth is. David, you in an article in the Irish Times this week, talking more about the US elections, but you said the global tectonic plates are shifting, and you said Europe needs to build its own vision of how to build a new world order. You clearly from that think we're missing the vision thing now. What did you mean? And what is your basic answer to this question of, are we capable and ready now but don't have the vision, or are we not yet capable and prepared?
Well, I agree with, everything that the three other panelists have said. The EU is not a country. And I think that the difficulty of when the EU to be a geopolitical actor, it's not going to be a geopolitical actor in the way the United States or China or Russia try to do so, because that's not what it is. And as we were discussing at the other event this morning, and as Tony has highlighted and others, the EU has a huge capacity to be an influential international actor. Whether that's trade, whether that's aid, whether that's humanitarian aid, whether that's climate change, regulatory matters, the EU is hugely influential, and particularly in the multilateral fora. What it doesn't do is classic geopolitics, as Rosa pointed out, because that's not who we are. And we have to, I think we have to adjust our expectation, that not expecting the EU to behave as though it's a single country with integrated military assets and so forth. What I feel is that the relative decline of the US and the relative withdrawal of the US from global leadership, and I emphasize relative because it's still going to be the single most important and hugely influential, but we are clearly living through a period where there's the power relationship is shifting between the great powers. We in Europe need to adjust to that. I mean, we have kind of, I won't say, I don't think we were a free rider on the US, but we benefited hugely from the alliance with the US, and they were the leaders, and we were mostly able to sort of follow. I don't think that's going to continue. So we need to develop our own vision of what this multipolar world is going to look like. how we want to see it built and how we can work with our closest and most important partner, which will be the United States, in defending our interests and our values, which we share uniquely with the US in ways we don't share with others. But we still need to engage with China, with Russia, with Turkey. And I also agree that the issue of the neighborhood is, of course, particularly important. So that's my general take on all of this. I think it is important, but I just think we need to stop trying to judge the EU's behavior as though it was a single single country, like some of the other.
We'll come back to America in a moment, but just link to that then. If the clout, if the leverage is more in the trade and the economic area, do we need to be, whatever your definition of it is, more geopolitical? Some people say we're far too technocratic when it comes to trade negotiations, and we should be more political in those negotiations. Do you share that view, David? Just to follow up, is that vision?
I think we are a bit more political than people give us credit for. But it is true that the key thing that a geopolitical union means, and it's fine to say geopolitical commission, but let's not forget, we've got 27 member states who actually in the end decide what happens. The key thing is the integration of our instruments, trade, regulatory, aid, and so forth. I think we still have not succeeded in bringing these instruments together in an integrated way. We sometimes do that very successfully in an enlargement negotiation, for example. But you know, our external policy cannot only be about enlargement, and we need to learn from the enlargement lesson how we can apply this integrated approach to relations with other actors, particularly.
Tony, can I come back on the question of the Biden administration, the incoming Biden administration? And Herman Van Rompuy talked about this in his opening speech when he said it's superficial to say, oh, we'll have Trumpism without Trump. This is a profound geopolitical change. And he said, we'll have our differences, but there will be a framework and openness to discuss and talk about those differences in a normal way, was the way he put it. But we saw Angela Merkel earlier this week, and something David echoed in that article I mentioned in the Irish Times, talking about the EU also needed to recognize, and did recognize, that it needed to rebalance the relationship, take more responsibility, be a more equal partner. What's your advice now to the European Union as it approaches a Biden administration about how do we take this chance to revitalize that transatlantic relationship and really make it work on the key issues of our day that the two sides, as David said, can and do align very much?
Yeah, sure. So I think there will be a dramatic change. And by the way, this dramatic change goes back to what we were doing on a bipartisan basis before this administration, with all the ups and downs that existed and with all the crises that certainly existed. But we're going to go back to quote unquote normality. But let's not be naive. No one is being naive. I think in the incoming team, I speak privately, of course, but the view, I think, is very much that we have a window of opportunity, probably 2 years before the midterms, right? 2 years to get something done, probably less, because it takes months to get people on the ground, and personnel is policy. So what are we actually going to do? All the policy papers that have been written by the transition team have focused on relatively uncontroversial things that can be done quickly and that are meaningful. And so indeed, our European partners and the EU itself will have to ask themselves the question, not what freebies to give us, that's not how things work, no freebies are given, but where can we actually make movement? And the reason this is so important is I really believe, I think many people in Europe believe, that if we fail to make the case to our respective populations, and we in the United States to our populations, that working within the rules, working with allies, working in the multilateral system yields better results than bullying, harassing, and undermining allies and rules and institutions, then we've got a real problem 4 years from now. You know, we'll be faced with a Trump 2.0 or Ivanka 1.0. So the short answer, going on too long, the short answer I think is, okay, look, are there some things where there can be movement? Yes, of course it's going to be on defense spending and how we spend on defense, but how can we sit down with the United States and actually try to reform the rules, work better on China, because it's all about China, China, China. I mean, that's going to be the number one issue. And then also, you know, can we get a trade deal that is quick and meaningful in the first 18 months?
Okay, thank you. Natalie, please do comment on the relationship, the transatlantic relationship, but I also want to bring in China now because it's a short discussion. We had lots of questions right from the moment we started this afternoon's conference about China. There was one about talking about the breakup of the UK, not Brexit, but talking about the breakup of the UK and the deepened transatlantic rift. We're now talking about maybe repairing that. Is the EU in a position to make its position towards China clearer? Question about human rights in relation to China. Lots of questions. There is a deep concern about the EU's position and how a Biden administration changes that or doesn't change that dynamic, whether the EU and US can really work together now on this issue, or whether we're going to see divergences under the new administration. What is your feeling about the transatlantic relationship and then about the China question?
Okay, Jackie. So, I mean, on the transatlantic relationship, yes, I mean, I agree this is going to be an opportunity for a major sort of reset of the relationship. And there are a number of fundamental things that will change. And yes, it is about tone, but tone matters. It is about, to an extent, it's about substance. So I do not expect US troops to be further withdrawn from Europe, for instance. It is about the approach. So indeed, it's about a US re-engaging in multilateralism, beginning with coordinating with Europeans over COVID-19, COP26, and also looking at the triptych, G7, G20, COP26, to sort of essentially playing in the same team to ensure that a recovery post-pandemic is going to be a green recovery. So all that will fundamentally change. I do not expect a sort of significant re-engagement in the neighborhood because I think there is a sort of structural reasons, which then takes me to the China piece, to saying that I think for very understandable reasons, the United States expects the EU to do the heavy lifting here, precisely for the reasons that Tony was mentioning, meaning that this is where we have a comparative advantage. And also because, which allows me to sort of shift to the China piece, China is, as everyone says, and I absolutely agree, is going to be the first, the second, third priority of US foreign policy over the next 4 years, which kind of brings me to the EU-China and EU-US-China relationship. And I think in some respects, as Europeans, sort of our internal situation is actually conducive to developing, I think, a more substantial and certainly cohesive China approach. Because I think that internally within the EU, obviously there are still differences and divisions, but I think the trend is essentially that towards greater convergence and convergence towards a harder line towards China. And, you know, I could go into the reasons for this, but I don't think we have the time for it. Now, externally, at the same time, the European predicament is going to be a more complicated one. For reasons that have to do with the US-China confrontation and the fact that I think moving forward under a Biden administration, in many respects, I think that confrontation may actually deepen further. Because things like human rights and Hong Kong and Taiwan, by the way, which are all things that Europeans care a lot about, but they will be added issues to a confrontational relationship.
Thank you. Rosa, on this question, particularly of China, but also your thoughts on the Biden administration. And then David, I'd like to come back to you in terms of what being more equal partners, maybe using China as an example of how you see that developing. But Rosa first.
Yeah, I mean, when we all agree, I'm not going to repeat because I agree what others have been saying. So I think on the transatlantic piece, I think 2 points. The first is that it's critical that transatlantic allies do something quickly to restore mutual trust and to show the world we're still here and we can still work together. And that's really important. So I think we'll see some gestures coming from the Biden administration and that Europeans should definitely leap onto that boat. At the same time, in Europe, we need to avoid any complacency that we're going back to 2016 or even before. And it's really important that Europeans keep the focus on continuing to build this concept of strategic autonomy, that need not be understood as antithetical to transatlanticism. I think that's a big in the debate, especially in Germany. There's either one or the other. That's not the point. The transatlantic relationship now, the US now wants Europe to be more independent. And the challenge will be to have a grown-up conversation on those areas where Europeans and Americans disagree, because they will continue to be so. I think I agree with Natalie on China. Europe is converging and it's much closer to the US position than anything else. But there still will be areas where they disagree, and they need to talk about it and build trust and track two conversations to work through those areas of divergence.
Thank you. David, coming back, and Herman Van Rompuy talked in his opening about when it comes to relations with third countries, not just being a junior partner or suivisme following the US. And you have also emphasized the need for the EU to step up to the plate and to play that role. What does that mean in practical terms? And when it comes to China and building what you've called a more balanced relationship with China, how do you see, what does the EU need to do now? And linking that to the transatlantic question, how can it best work with the US to make sure that it is an equal partner or a more equal partner in this conversation and not a follower?
Well, to the first part of your question, I mean, the agenda is kind of what Tony has mentioned and what others have talked about. So it's security and defense. We have to try and put to bed for once and for all this prevailing sense in the United States that we're not doing enough. And I don't think that should only be about the 2% objective, because frankly, it's not just about how much you spend. President Trump thinks this is all about how much American kit we will buy. We need also to look at the value for money in our own defense expenditure, and that can only be done through European cooperation, through EU cooperation, EU, NATO. So we need to try and do a package of measures which brings that together in a way that the Americans can feel that indeed the Europeans are carrying their share of the responsibility. On trade, it means trying to get rid of this prevailing sense that somehow they're treated unfairly by the Europeans. I don't personally think that's necessarily true, but I think we need to try and find a package of measures that enables us to say, look, we have reached a balanced outcome, and that will include something on agriculture. I'm not talking about TTIP, but we'll need to find something on agriculture that works for both sides. We need to address the digital issues, which are going to be quite complicated. And then on China, look, I agree with everything that's been said, but I think the important thing is that what is wrong, what's wrong is not Trump being tough on China. It's that the attitude of confrontation is ultimately a cul-de-sac. China can decouple from us more quickly than we can decouple from China. The last thing we need is a decoupled China. But so we need a more nuanced approach where we, on the one hand, are tough jointly with China, and not just the EU, US, but with other like-minded countries, Japan and so forth, where we're tough on things, subsidies, on trade, bad trade practices, even human rights and so forth, agree with all of that. But at the same time, we engage. We offer a constructive agenda about how China can contribute constructively, climate change, the Iran deal. We have to get that balance. And I hope that where the Biden administration will take a more nuanced approach than the very bludgeony approach of Trump, which in my view ultimately leads us to negative outcomes. So I think we should be able to work with the US on a much more balanced approach to China.
Tony, did you want to react on that?
Well, as usual, I agree with everything David says. You know, I think we have a lot of work domestically in the United States to make it clear to the American people, at least those who are prepared to listen, that burden sharing is not just about military spending. It's about sharing burdens, which include burdens on the climate change, fighting climate change, and fighting or dealing with the issue of migration, where Europe certainly has been a leader. You know, that will probably not fall on many sympathetic ears, but we should try. You know, on the issue of defense spending, I think Europe faces a major issue here, if I may say, and that's the perception of the threat that isn't there. Europeans see the threat on climate change, but I think Europeans don't see the threat in military terms. And the Pew Center has had very interesting studies have shown that most people don't see a threat and therefore are not willing to spend money to combat a threat. Now that's going to be a very difficult thing to reverse, and I hope the work is going to happen toward that. I agree with David. Look, on proposals on EU reform, the most bizarre thing about the Trump administration is the view that the United States doesn't need the EU to deal with China. We can do it alone, we can do it better, we can bludge them into submission, and guess what? It's failed. You know, the phase 1 trade deal has failed. So the first thing is going to change is indeed working with the EU on its reform of the WTO package. Now, the last thing I'll say very quickly, this is one of my favorite topics. I wrote a paper, hopefully, you know, for the campaigns on standards. And when I was looking into this, I saw there's bipartisan legislation in the House that is called, it's called the Ensuring American Leadership Over International Standards Act 2019. And finally, we're waking up to the fact, as the Chinese have woken up many years ago, of the importance that who writes the rules sets, you know, it enshrines advantages for exporters and determines values around the world. Together with the EU, let's do this. Let's have a common policy to the extent we can in terms of making sure that the key international standard setting bodies actually enshrine our values.
Thank you. I'm going to have another go at giving Paul Avatsmark the floor. Paul, I have allowed you to talk if you want to take the floor. If I don't hear from you, Paul, are you there? Okay, I'm going to go to Malcolm Harbour. Malcolm, can you turn on your mic and what's your question?
Yeah, am I unmuted now?
Yep,
yeah.
I can hear you beautifully. Brief one.
Well, I'm really delighted about Anthony Gardner talking about standards, because that was my point. And I just draw your attention, I am co-author of an EPC paper about the importance of standards for global competitiveness. And even though you were warning Jackie a bit earlier about us becoming too technocratic, I just recall from my many years in the European Parliament how Pascal Lamy once reminded us that Europe has the best single market technology in the world, you know, because we have a more integrated market than anywhere else. But at the moment, we haven't got our standards making act together. And we're seeing China moving in, as Anthony said, to chair a lot of the key committees, particularly in digital ones. And so this is a plea for this aspect to become far higher profile and more integrated. And I think that will be something that a Biden administration, I hope, if Anthony agrees, would be sympathetic to, and we can move quickly on that. But the Commission has to get its approval of EU Standards Act together. If you read our report, you will see why.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Fraser Cameron, unmute yourself and away you go.
I think if Tony is putting these priorities at the top of his list, we might be in for some disappointment. I just simply don't see, I mean, the biggest problem we have, Tony, is Germany. And Germany's not going to increase its defense spending. There's an election coming up next year. So the debate has to be widened, as David argued and I argued this morning, into a wider concept of security. So if you have any influence in the Biden team, get away from the 2% and try and introduce a transatlantic discussion on the broader aspects of security and how we can share burdens in that sense, because an increase in defense spending to the extent that you want it is simply not going to happen in the next 12 or 18 months, you know, before the next midterms. Ditto trade deal. Do you think we're going to solve the problems of tech and agriculture in the next 18 months? I rather doubt it. So if we're going to go for quick fixes and deals, let's look at climate as number one, because that's obviously going to be on the horizon. Let's have another look at health, and let's have a look at some other global issues. But I think the three you identified, Tony, are simply going to be very disputatious over the next 18 months.
Thank you very much. Tony, quick reaction, quick one if you would on that. And then I want to just ask one question about strategic autonomy before we try and draw some conclusions. But did you want to react to what Fraser said, Tony? Yeah.
Well, look, with David, I have, you know, scars on my back from TTIP. No one says we're going back to TTIP 2.0, no, but there are things we can do. And we've now written papers and, you know, I think it's doable. Look, getting rid of industrial tariffs on goods, right, is doable. Accompanied, as David said, with some movement on ag, not on the really tough issues, but on some SPS issues. That's doable. Lifting the unilateral sanctions and the counter sanction, that's doable. I think it's doable to settle the Airbus-Boeing dispute. It's doable to extend the scope of the pharma mutual recognition agreement. That's doable. It's doable to make progress on non-safety auto standards. That's doable. You know, there are about 10 things I think we can do in 18 months. So, you know, I'm slightly less pessimistic.
Thank you. And just so that you know, there's a request, Tony, come in. Please share the reference you mentioned earlier on in your remarks about standards. I just wanted to touch briefly, and David, perhaps to you first, on strategic autonomy. We talked earlier, Rosa started talking about what do we mean when we talk about a geopolitical actor. And I have the same question still about strategic autonomy and what it really means, and how do we ensure that it doesn't either mean or be interpreted as a form of fortress Europe. What does it mean to you, and how do we make sure it doesn't, the message doesn't get misunderstood, as it were?
Well, I mean, there's always a risk, frankly, particularly from the Anglo-Saxon press, that anytime the Europeans use phrases like that, it's Fortress Europe. The 1992 project was Fortress Europe. I mean, I remember we had to push back very heavily. This is not about Fortress Europe. It is about Europe taking more responsibility for its own affairs and developing the capacity to be more independent in some of its decision making. And the obvious example, if you take the Iran deal, look at the way in which our efforts to preserve that deal were undermined by the extraterritorial impact of the secondary sanctions. Now, this is fixable if you want to have a greater internationalization of the euro, for example. And that would be the single most important thing, in my view, we could do to develop some kind of strategic autonomy in the foreign policy field, would be to have a greater use of the euro and less dependence on the dollar transactions and less vulnerability to secondary sanctions, and so on and so forth. So it is simply about developing greater capacity. But it is in the end, and this is the only point I want to make, Jackie, our external credibility, which I think, as Federica said in the private session this morning, is actually much higher than we sometimes realize, because people outside the EU sometimes value us, our role more than we do ourselves. But it flows from our internal effectiveness. When we work well internally, we project well. So it's also about, you know, making a success of the Green Deal, making a success of the digital transition, making a success of the single market and the adaptations and the capital markets. All of those things give us greater external credibility and increase our ability to be geopolitical and to be more strategically autonomous.
Thank you. We are almost out of time, but I did want to ask you, and I want to start with Natalie this time. Natalie, as we look to the future, and we've talked specifically about the relationship with the US, we've talked about China, lots of other things we haven't had a chance to touch on. But for you, if we are to be able to answer the question, are we capable and are we prepared to be a geopolitical actor, however you define that in the new world, for you, what is the key next thing we need to do to not only have the capacity, but also the willingness, the preparedness, the readiness to play that role, to step up to the plate, and to as David was talking about earlier, develop a vision so we know what we want to do with that role? What for you is the key priority now? Same question to you all. Natalie, Rosa, Tony, and David.
Jackie, I would say that to me, the priority is to actually do something and stop talking about it. I don't mind what, yeah, just do it, yeah. We've been talking about becoming strategically autonomous. We've set up all sorts of instruments to make it happen. And we talk about having to be prepared for the next crisis. Hey, we're surrounded by crises. They're already here. And they're here, and we're waiting for the United States to take care of them, and they're not going to. And they're not going to under the Obama administration, under the Trump administration, and they won't under the Biden administration. So take your pick. My personal pick would be Libya at the moment, where if we take all of these cases, if we take Libya, if we take Nagorno-Karabakh at the moment, I mean, if we take any of these conflicts, what we're seeing is that if we don't do anything, the United States doesn't do anything, then others do. And those others tend to be Turkey, they tend to be Russia, and hey, they don't tend to do things that go in exactly our direction. So my priority would be doing something, and it doesn't require, by the way, new capabilities. Okay. We have all the capabilities to do it. It requires being willing to take risks.
Okay, thank you very much. Rosa.
Well, I think I agree with Natalie, but let me just perhaps slightly on a broader scale. As was discussed in the previous panel, the July package, your EU recovery package, was a transformative moment. and it's very much geared towards transforming European economy in a digital and green direction. If the EU can do this in an inclusive manner with its international partners and offer a different model of development and reach out to these countries and these people with this type of proposal, which means, for instance, including incentives for fighting climate change, not just sanctions on climate change, that I think would send a very powerful message to the rest of the world that there's an actor there that is not just thinking about its own recovery, but is thinking about it in terms of global public goods.
Thank you very much. Tony.
Well, for me, there's no bigger issue than China right now. It faces both of us in the US and the EU. And I see a real opportunity now, windows indicated before, for us to work together in many areas, whether it's foreign direct investment screening, which the EU obviously is doing and member states are doing, using the power of our market, including public procurement markets, to drive change in China, WTO reform together, and also changing competition rules in the case of the EU, and driving standards. I'm glad to see that Malcolm is there because he's done more than anyone in the Parliament and afterwards on artificial intelligence, on facial recognition, on video surveillance. All of these things are critically important also to the health of our democracies and the nature of our public debate. So that's where the EU can really be very useful.
Thank you very much. David, you have the last word, your key priority.
I think it would be the neighborhood. I mean, I agree with Natalie in one sense. Let's try and make something work and demonstrate that we are actually capable of shaping events. And I do think the neighborhood more generally is going to be a major issue for us, because I think the US will be less interested. They will be supportive, but they will not want to get directly involved. And that should be our main focus. The other point, on a more technical thing, I just want to come back to the internationalization of the euro, because I really believe that is actually a foreign policy decision as much as an economic and financial decision. And I think it really needs work. And we know there's a German problem. There's a few German problems around, but I think really that needs to be taken forward, because that is the single most important way in which we can have slightly greater freedom of maneuver also in the foreign policy field.
And on that note, I wish we had another half an hour to go on discussing these things, but thank you all very much indeed for a great discussion. I'm playing audience today because they can't thank you. Really grateful to you for giving us the time and sharing your thoughts with us. So thank you so much for all of that. One thing that's quite striking is there's been almost no mention, in fact none, except through one question about the Conference on the Future of Europe. This great debate that was supposed to happen with the European public about the future of Europe, held up, of course, some of the practical arrangements by the COVID-19 pandemic, but nevertheless, quite striking, it hasn't started. We're still waiting for it to develop. I was very struck by one of the first questions we got this afternoon when talking about the level playing field was from Sylvia Kotanidis, who said, what role for the Conference of the Future of Europe on this question? Broader question, what role for the Conference of the Future of Europe generally? What is it going to talk about? What should it talk about? And what should be done with its outcomes? I'm delighted to introduce and welcome to join me for this discussion Gabi Bischoff, MEP, who is Vice Chair of the European Parliament's Committee on Constitutional Affairs, Enrico Letta, who is Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po in Paris and President of the Jacques Delors Institute, and Janis Emmanouilidis, the EPC's Director of Studies. A very warm welcome to all three of you. Great to have you with us. And as I say, doesn't get talked about very much. This great idea to have a debate with the public. Let me start. Gabi, for you, how important do you believe the Conference on the Future of Europe is? And is the lack of public attention to it simply because it hasn't got started and all the conversation has been about how it will be constituted, who will lead it, etc., etc. And once it gets going, do you think it has the potential to be really important, or are you worried that it'll be a bit of a damp squib? You're muted. Can you just unmute yourself?
Yes, I can. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for the invitation. And indeed, at the moment, this conference, besides the Brussels bubble, is just a rumor. People know that something is in the pipeline, but they are waiting and wondering why nothing is happening yet. But I think that this conference, especially as we are within a huge pandemic and challenges we never had before, that this conference is a big opportunity. And but I have to say, it is only a big opportunity to reconnect with citizens and to get out of this process of just muddling through, or only move and being able for reforms. If you have so much pressure, like we had with the start of the pandemic, but in a more reflected way, involve the citizens in this debate, what needs to be reformed, what needs to be changed, and also to see what appetite is there within our societies, with the citizens for these changes. Let me just illustrate this. I mean, when the pandemic struck in March, what we could see was, again, the first reflex we had in the European Union was close the border, look at your national solution, and even not coordinate anything, but just focus on your national interest. Then there was a sort of shock phase where people, when they realized what is happening, thought, okay, realized we will not fight a pandemic with an approach like this. And then as we have seen the challenge and what is happening at the same time in all member states, being able under this pressure to agree on the first step, like the SURE program and the others, that was a huge step forward, a more solidaric way, a kind of Eurobonds to do this, but only really under this pressure. And for me, the conference is an opportunity to create a European public space, to involve the citizen with a bottom-up approach from the beginning. And then after this 2-year process, also to give a clear feedback what happens with the proposals, demands citizens did, and how will the institutions react.
Absolutely.
And to finalize, not to have a process like we had with the report of the presidents, be it the report of the 4 presidents or of the 5 presidents on the reform of the EMU. We know for years we have to do it, but no one has the courage, and it's not about collecting nice reports and putting it somewhere in the cupboard.
Okay, I want to come back on what we do with it a little later, if I might, Gabby. But Enrico, Letta, from your perspective, Gabby says it is a big opportunity. How important do you think the conference will be? And do you think its importance has increased because of COVID-19? I mean, I noticed that Angela Merkel, German Chancellor, was talking about, for example, now we must talk about the health union. That must be part of the conversation that the conference has. Has COVID-19 made it more important, or has it really pushed some of these issues, do you think, onto the back burner?
You know, in my ranking from 0 to 100 to 100, before COVID, it was 80. Now it is 100. It is 100 because of many reasons. You know, this legislature for the European Union is the one in which we can reach enormous results. We already had fantastic results in the first year. And this is a legislature where there are 3 missions: green, technology, and the world. Green, because of what we know, technology, but also the world, because this idea of the geopolitical commission, you mentioned this point in the previous panel, very interesting. And what is the which is the fil rouge among these 3 missions? At the end of the day, the fil rouge is democracy and citizens. Democracy and citizens, because the green is because of the citizens' push, is because of the citizens' approach to citizens' future. Technology, it is because of democracy, is changing because of technology, but also for the geopolitical mission, the world. Why we define ourselves as a power? We are a superpower of democratic values. And we think that this flagship of democratic values is so important. So my point is, can we continue with the incoherent way to work at the European level in terms of governance? I make just one example to show how incoherent we are. The designation of the big boss of the European Commission. That is the way in which usually the word sees how we decide, who we are. And in the last 3 legislatures, take Barroso, Juncker, and von der Leyen, we applied 3 different decision-making processes to get the outcome. Barroso coming just from an internal, like a conclave discussion among the leaders of the European Council. Juncker, Spitzenkandidaten, the European parties, it was a completely different approach. Then today, von der Leyen with Vestager and Timmermans, a mix between the conclave and the Spitzenkandidaten during the electoral campaign. So it is totally incoherent. We can't have in 2009, 2014, 2019 on the most visible democratic point, that is the designation of the big boss. So I think this is a key issue. And this is, of course, related also, and is my last point about the participation of the citizens. We know very well that today there's a great opportunity. There are expectations from our citizens towards Europe, because we defeated populism on some aspects. So we have to deliver on this point, and the conference can be the right opportunity to do so.
Thank you, and come back later, because I think you're pointing there to you see for this conference quite a broad remit in terms of addressing some of these issues. Be interested to see where you think the focus should be. But Janis, complete the picture for us in terms of the importance of this conference. And can I just ask you, does it matter? We've seen months of delay, partly because of COVID, partly because of arguments about its remit and what will be done with the results, partly about its leadership. Does this delay matter? Or do you think once it gets up and running, the attention will be there, the focus will be there, and it will play an important role?
Thank you, Jackie. Let me start with the question of the significance of the conference, or the potential significance. Let me start by saying that the conference will take place. We don't know when exactly it will start. We don't know the exact process, but it will take place. And I think we should make the best out of it. That should be the working assumption in terms of what to do with respect to the conference. Now, is it important? Is it more important than it was before the COVID-19 crisis? I think yes, I agree with what Gabi and what Enrico were saying. It is more important because the crisis has shown that we are, with respect to different issues, not only health, but the crisis is having multiple consequences. We are underwhelmed in terms of our ability to deal with many of the consequences of the crisis. So we need to have an honest, critical self-reflection about what the European Union should and should not do. And yes, we should concentrate on those issues which are of a transformational nature. And the COVID-19 crisis has been in many ways an accelerator of different developments and trends which we had witnessed even before the crisis erupted. And I think that the conference should concentrate on these transformational changes and have a transnational deliberation about them, because this is what you need if you actually want to get something done, also at the European level, by the way, also at the national level. You need to have a broader debate about actually it will require to do these transformational challenges, to deal with these transformational challenges. And here I think the conference can play a role. Will it be really important? To tell you the truth, I don't know, because we do not know what actually will be the level of ambition. We do not know whether, with respect to the final outcome, one actually wants to get to something which is tangible enough in order to make a difference. So with respect to will it be important, the answer to that, I think, cannot be given from today's perspective. Now, with respect to the time frame, I think it does matter. And I'll tell you why. Because I think that Gabi mentioned in the beginning, the conference seems as if it's a rumor. People have heard of it or haven't heard of it, and they don't know what it's about. And I think that before the summer break, there was a bit of momentum. People were starting to discuss of what actually will we do in the context of the conference. Now we're in the middle of November. We still don't have the joint declaration. The institutions have not been able to agree on it. We know what the key issue is. It relates to who shall lead the Conference on the Future of Europe. That's the key issue we need to settle. And because of all these delays, there is the expectations which have been there are not being fulfilled. So people are asking themselves, will this conference actually take place? What will it be about? And if this is the case, and if we drag it on further, the momentum which we had at some point, and there have been some forces who have been supportive of the conference, that momentum, even if it hasn't been too strong, will be lost further. So I think it matters that we have this delay. I think we should get it started. I'm confident that there will be a joint declaration. I think that the German Council presidency is pushing for it. They want to tick that box. And once you have the agreement on the joint declaration, you get things started, there will also be more interest in it.
Can I just come back, Enrico, to what Janis just said there about what it should focus on? He said it should concentrate on those issues which are transformational in nature. We got a couple of questions from the audience asking about, for example, can the Conference on the Future of Europe constitute an opportunity for the EU to establish itself as a European democracy? So can we describe it as a democratic union of democratic states? So, and you said earlier, we can't continue with the incoherent way of working in terms of governance at EU level. Is that the sort of thing you want the conference to talk about? Do you want it to focus on policy areas? What do you think the scope should be? Should it be fairly narrow, or should it be very wide indeed?
Well, of course, what Janis said is very important, because there's a lot of uncertainties around the method, around the destination of all this exercise. So we have to be very cautious. We are in a period in which tensions among member states, among institutions are very high. There's the recovery plan, the next generation EU, the new wave of pandemic. So we have to be very cautious. But my point is that if we want to be a superpower of democratic values, we have to work on how strengthening and making the evolution of our democracy. You know, what is happening and what happened in the US elections and in the US democracy, it is something that is shocking us, of course. We were all shocked. But my point is that it is so precious, so delicate to have democracies working, that we have to work on how to implement, how to reinforce, how to relaunch our democracy. And that means, first of all, how to help citizens working and being completely involved, how to make citizens part of this process. When I see the young people working on Fridays for Future last year, it was fantastic to see how big was this goodwill to be part of a process. So I think we need to help Europe to be avant-garde in the modern democracy. We need to enlarge the way in which participation can work. Deliberative, participative democracy is something that have to be put on the table. I think there are good experiences that in France, for instance, they had. In Ireland, they had good experiences. It is the way to push in the direction to reinforce democracy and to concretely say, we think that democracy is an asset, is not a minus in a world of autocracies, in a world in which around us we have full of brute, as we say. So this is our main goal, and we have to work in that direction.
Thank you, Enrico. We seem to have lost your camera. It would be lovely to get you back and be able to see you, but if you're having technical problems, don't worry. But if you can, there we are. It's back on. Gabby, you said earlier we need to talk about what needs to be reformed, what needs to be changed, what appetite there is for those changes. I mentioned earlier we had a question right at the beginning about should the conference, for example, discuss the level playing field issues we were talking about earlier. Should it, somebody's even said, should it discuss the end of the EU and a founding of a real European Republic, or is the EU too big? Just how big should the topics be? There are a long list of priorities that the Council, the Commission, Parliament have come up with, a long list of topics. Do you think that's the approach, or should we focus just on a few strategic priorities and then focus on, we'll come back to the delivery of those things later on. But for you, how do we define the agenda here?
I think it's not a surprise that everyone knows if you have a long list of priorities, you have no priorities. And that if you want to have a good structured approach and you are looking that you want in the end also some results, you have to focus. But I think here it is very important for me on what do you focus? I mean, do you put the priorities you have anyway? Like if you say it's the strategic agenda, we have that, so we take that, that's it. Or if you say, okay, if I want to have a process where I involve the citizens, you also have to do it in a way that that the citizens get interested. And I think, as Enrico said, the question of democracy is something that is essential. And you can see it also for citizens. On one hand, it's that people see in these times that that democracies are changing, and some even feel there is a lack of democracy, or they look at the European Union and they see the different perceptions in the member states of democracy. So I think this question for citizens is much more interesting than just to discuss institutions. Because they are interested in the outcome, what the institutions produce, not so much in institutional debates. And I think when I take up the point that Janis made, or sort of on the transitional aspects, I think it is very much important. If I look at migration, if I look at, for example, how secure do people feel, also in terms of their employment or social security, that for citizens, one key aspect, and I think we know this especially since 2015 and what happened in terms of migration and the pictures we had all over Europe, is the European capacity in the key areas capable to act? Or where do we have expectations? If I look at foreign policies, people don't understand that one small country can block so that the European Union has no clear message or opinion regarding a challenging thing that is happening in the world. Things like this. So I think if we really want to involve citizens, we have to find a way on setting priorities that are open enough so that the citizens also can say, this is an important issue for me, for us, to put it on the list and not confront them with a list of X priorities and this is the way how we do it. And the last thing I would like to say is also in the way we organize this communication. It cannot be in a Brussels bubble language, but really to have a way how we approach citizens that they want to get involved and also can bring in what is important for them in their daily lives.
Thank you. And I want to come back to how we involve citizens in a moment, but let me pick up on a question that's come in from Gerald Christian Heintekes. Does it really make a lot of sense to have a conference on the future of Europe if member states in the council deny the possibility of treaty change? And the EU, I should just mention here, the EPC with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and EFOC did a survey of the Brussels bubble, and there they were talking about, yeah, we need to have the possibility to change the treaties, but only in cases where we actually need to do it. Enrico, Letta, does treaty change need to be on the table? How do you see the outcomes of this conference, the products of it, and what we do with them then?
I know it is the key issue. It is the big problem, the elephant in the room. But I have to say that there's already one point in the agenda, in the priorities. And the point is health. Because Ursula von der Leyen clearly put this point in her speech, in her very good speech on the State of the Union, and this speech was approved by the member of parliament, by leaders, by the council. There was a general approval. And I see many difficulties to implement this part, the part on health, without a treaty change, because it is clear that health is out of the competences of the European Union. And it was out of the competences, and that was one of the reasons why at the very beginning of this crisis, we had a lot of difficulties. So if we de-ideologize the discussion, and we start by saying, listen, it's not a question to be federalistic or not federalistic, it's a point to be very concrete for the needs of our people, as Ursula von der Leyen did. And this point of the health, on the conference on the health and the competences on the health, can be, I think, a good idea on the method. In the way in which Gabriele Bischoff said, I completely share what she said. I think it was very good in terms of how to define priorities.
Thank you. Janis, I'll come back to you in a minute, but I just wanted to follow up, Gabby, both really on the question of what we do with the outcome, and how do we balance the inputs from a deliberative process like this with representative democracy? What weight do we attach to what is said by the citizens in a conference of this kind? How do you see the relationship with your work as a parliamentarian, as a representative politician? What are we going to do with the outcomes, and how do we manage those expectations so we don't undersell? People think, what's the point? But we don't oversell in terms of what it can deliver.
Yeah, I will come to it, but I just want to bring in, I think, a very good point that was in the German-French paper. I did find it very constructive to say we do not exclude treaty changes. Why would you do such a process if you already before it starts exclude certain things? But to have this openness, and I think this would cover it all. And I think indeed what you mentioned, the expectation management will be key. You cannot raise expectations that in the end where you cannot deliver. So for us in the parliament, it was very important that in our concept, the whole conference consists of equal levels. It is on one hand the institutional level and the citizens' agoras. And that we make sure in this process that not only the citizens can discuss in the agoras and come up with proposals, but that we have really feedback loops so they get a feedback on what happened with their proposals. And this would be the difference to all the consultation processes we did. I mean, this is not the first project we are doing of this sort. And to finalize, I always see this conference on the future of Europe as the prelude to a convention.
Okay, thank you.
And this would be a process where we have to say what will follow when the conference is there and what will happen with the results then. But it is not a convention, and I think we have to also make it very clear.
Thank you very much. And Janis, you've been involved in lots of citizen consultation projects of different types. In terms of involving citizens and how we do that most effectively in terms of the role of civil society, of think tanks and so on. How do you see that? And of course, all of this in the context of COVID-19, which is going to put restrictions on the way we can bring these people together. So how do you see getting that involvement, getting it right, but also this question of expectation?
I'll come to this, but let me take a minute to respond to two of the issues which have been discussed. One with respect to treaty change. I think this should not be the starting point. We need treaty change. The starting point is we have a couple of strategic priorities, issues we need to discuss in the context of the conference. I think it should be the transformational issues of green, digital, and Europe's global role. Once we discuss these issues, we get to the conclusion of what we need to do, what actually we want to do in order to progress in these areas, also to put pressure also on member states, on the system to perform better when it comes to these transformational challenges. And then we need to ask ourselves, can we do that on the basis of the current treaties or not? This is the sequence. You don't start with treaty change, you start with a problem. Second point, with respect to the number of issues, I think less is more. And that should be the starting point. Less is more. And it was interesting when you listen to the speech of Chancellor Merkel in the European Parliament before the start of the German presidency. She also highlighted that we should concentrate on the things which we think are the most important things. I think this is the right avenue. Now, with respect to citizens' involvement, first of all, we always have to have in mind that the conference will have two dimensions. One is the citizens' dimensions, which a lot of people are concentrating on when they're thinking of the conference, but it will also have a representative dimension, representatives of the Commission, of the member states, of national parliaments, of the European Parliament, and both dimensions will be important, and we need to link these two dimensions with each other. With respect to the citizens' involvement, I think transnational agoras, which the European Parliament has proposed, selections of randomly selected citizens from throughout the European Union, around 200-300 of them, having thematic deliberations on certain issues is a good starting point. Dealing not with one, but with many issues. But we also need to find ways of bringing the citizens dimension and the representative dimensions together. In one of the blueprints which the EPC presented already at the end of last year, we said that we need something like a conference assembly, where you get to the both dimensions at a certain point towards the end of the progress together. So there's a lot you need to do in terms of get the citizens involved. Now there is a lot of people who now say, with this, due to COVID-19, we cannot actually get the citizens involved. I think that this is myopic. I think if we are constructive, if we are a bit innovative, we could think of ways of how to get the citizens involved. I'll give you one example.
Very briefly now, Janis.
Yes, the joint declaration will come out with 7-8 issues which shall be dealt with. I think this is too much. Why don't we, online, put together what I would call a transnational citizens panel involving around 100 citizens from all around Europe to ask them, are these 7-8 issues which have been identified by the institutions the issues which the conference should deal with? And which of them are the most important ones? Which issues are missing? Which questions and issues should actually be dealt with in the context of the conference? These are things where you ask citizens early on in the process. You can also do that online. You don't need to do it in the real way.
You in full flow. Just a quick comment I'm going to read. It's put in the form of a question, but it's more of a comment. Do the panel agree with me was the nature of the question. So let me read it out. That the current far greater emphasis on civil society and respecting basic values in the public debate in Europe broadens significantly the opportunity of making a success on this debate on the future of Europe. And he asked, but we don't have time to answer it, can this debate coherently take place outside existing channels of political parties? But I wanted to, just by way of, and there's another question, I don't know if I can tempt you into this, Andrew Duff, who should be the president of the conference and who shouldn't it be? Enrico, you may want to plead the fifth here as your name has been mentioned in dispatches, but I don't know whether anybody wants to give me a thought on that. No, he's shaking his head. Let's leave that one. Let's park it there. But I wanted to ask you all before we close, and I want to come back to the title of our conference today. And we're talking about United in Adversity or My Country First. If we are to ensure that this conference is a success and it fosters a sense among the citizens that Europe really is united in adversity and is not headed inexorably down the path of my country first. For each of you, if you had to identify a key ingredient to make sure that it achieves the former and not the latter, what for each of you would it be? I'll start with Enrico, then to Gabby, and then to Janis. Enrico, one key ingredient to make this work.
It is very easy for me because I started working with 100 young people around Europe. We selected them. They are part of a process of participation through the Jacques Delors Institute and other institutions. I think the involvement of youth will be decisive for the success of this process, because youth means digital skills. Youth means the will to be involved in a new participation form, and youth means the future. We know very well that pandemic is creating a lot of anxieties for the future of youth. So my key point is that this conference will be a success if we are able to involve youth, really to involve youth in this conference. And this is, for me, the main issue today.
Thank you very much indeed. Gabby?
I mean, we came up with a proposal with youth, but for me to put in an ingredients, it will be very important that it's not an elite project, that it's not the white middle classes that will participate. that we really reach out to the huge variety in our society, and that we have transnational debates and not 27 isolated national debates.
So going back to where we borrowed the title, United in Diversity, was where we got the title for today's conference. Go back to that diversity principle and make sure we apply it. Janis, for you, the key ingredient to make it a success?
The first ingredient, and sorry for being conservative here, is that you have the strong backing of Paris and Berlin, that both of them want the conference to be a success. That is important. The second point is you need to have a clear idea of what the outcome shall be. You need something of an action plan with concrete and tangible results, with recommendations, proposals of what actually you want to deliver once the conference is over and when you get to implementation. So you need this kind of an action plan. And now I will not shy away from a question which was raised without mentioning a name, but I think the issue of leadership will also be clear. It will be important, because there will be a lot of open questions, a lot of unsettled issues, even if we have the joint declaration. So you will need someone who will be leading the conference, who has a strategic compass in terms of what she or he wants to achieve and how he or she wants to achieve it. Because there will be things which will not be clear with respect to the level of ambition and the process. And that person should ask for the right resources in order to be able to do that job, and not shy away from asking, because otherwise the leadership will not be able to be successful. And if that's the case, all this endeavor will backfire, because if it becomes just a fig leaf exercise, it's not worth doing. It's even dangerous.
And on that note, I'd like to thank you all very much. Just to mention, if you look in the chat box, ladies and gentlemen, some EPC publications relating and touching on this issue are mentioned with some links there. And Tony Gardner has also put the reference in to what he was talking about in the previous panel. So do take a look there. But as I said earlier, the audience can't thank you today. So it's for me to do it on their behalf. Thank you for a great discussion. And I wish we had even longer to talk about this, but unfortunately it's Friday night, it's 6 o'clock. So we'll finish on time with this panel. Thank you so much, Enrico, Gabby, and Janis. But it is not over yet, ladies and gentlemen. Before we close, we are going to have one last intervention, and I'm delighted, and there he is, he's popped up on the screen. I'm delighted to welcome the EPC's Chief Executive, Fabian Zuleeg, back from the Brexit talks. Fabian, your closing thoughts after a very rich afternoon, a very intense debate. Each panel could have lasted, and I wish it could have lasted double the time, but in the online world, we have to keep it concise. But your thoughts on what you've heard this afternoon?
Thank you very much, Jackie. It's been a packed day, so I will make no attempt to summarize what we've heard. I think it has been a very long day as well, especially for those which have been with us from the Strategic Council onwards this morning. It has been all day. So I will keep it relatively brief, but I wanted just to say a couple of words. I mean, clearly, we've heard about all of the different issues which we are facing in Europe at the moment, from the internal and the external level playing field, over Brexit, the international dimension, the geopolitical dimension, US, China, the conference on the future of Europe. I think there are clearly many tasks on the agenda, and we have this overarching challenge, which we all can't forget because it is affecting our lives every day, the COVID-19 crisis and all the implications of that. But I think what we've also heard about today are some positive signs, and it's good to also recall what Herman said about having hope and going back to some of that, certainly the victory of Joe Biden in the US, the developments of more effective treatments for the pandemic and vaccines, which hopefully will come online. The agreement at the European level on the MFF. So things are going in the right direction, at least in some areas. We'll see whether that also applies to Brexit. But turning to the EPC, I think what we have done in the EPC is we have covered these areas. And for those of you who are interested, we have just put up our annual report for 2019 on our website, which shows the breadth of issues we have covered, the depth of issues we have covered. But clearly the world has also changed, and we are now in a 2020 where this environment is the normal environment. But the EPC, I think, has very well adapted to this environment. We're actually doing more online now than we did offline. We're doing more events, more publications. And undoubtedly, while this is a challenge, I would also argue that we need to seize the opportunities of this new way of doing things. So we can bring in people into the discussion, which we normally would not have easily brought into the discussion. We can link much more between the member states. We can reach a pan-European audience. We can work together in a very different way than we have done beforehand. So from an EPC perspective, looking forward, this is also about changing our business model, seeing what of the innovations which have been forced upon us are actually useful innovations, which we will carry on into the future. And in that context, it's very useful to hear from all of you about the priorities you have, about the content which we should be focusing on. So the annual conference is always a very good moment to do that. But I hope we will continue to stay in that exchange from now on. So it just remains for me to thank the EPC's member and partners, in particular the King Baudouin Foundation, which has been a strategic partner for EPC for a long time, as well as our members. They have been there to support us also within this crisis, and they enable us to carry on the work we are carrying on. I also want to thank all the speakers and participants, not only today, but there's a special thanks to everyone who's spoken today, but also throughout the year. Clearly, we couldn't do what we are doing without the goodwill of all the people to participate in these discussions, to be part of our platform. So we are very grateful for that. We're also very grateful to the policymakers, to the decision makers, to the stakeholders who engage with us. Clearly, the job of a think tank is to influence EU policy. That is what we're doing on a daily basis, but it is only in the partnership with everyone that we can be effective in that. And I want to thank all the friends of EPC, which is thankfully still a very long list. The Strategic Council, which we met this morning, the Governing Board, and certainly also our President, Herman, continues to be a guiding light for us within the EPC. But finally, I want to very sincerely also thank the EPC staff. None of this would be possible without all of you. You do a magnificent job. You have adapted magnificently to this new situation. So the success of the EPC and the continued success of the EPC only happens because of everything you put into the EPC and the commitment you have. So thank you all, and thank you also to Jackie for managing us throughout the day. It has been 7 hours of intense discussion and thinking, and you have managed us as always very well. So thank you all, and I hope to see you again very soon at another EPC event.
Thank you very much, Fabian, and thank you to you and the team for bringing us together today and for making it all work so brilliantly and smoothly in the online world, seizing the opportunities that brings us rather than focusing on the downsides. And thank you. I'd just like to add my thanks to our speakers today, to our panels this afternoon for engaging in such interactive and lively discussions. And thank you to all of you for your comments and your questions. I managed to bring in many of them, not all of them. Apologies, time was against us. But thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. It only remains for me to wish you a very pleasant weekend and stay safe. Goodbye from all of us. Bye-bye.
Bye.